So with the housekeeping out of the way, I'd now like to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Bruce Hoffman. Professor Hoffman is a tenured professor in Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, where he is the director of the Center for Security Studies and the Security Studies program. Prior to this, his many accomplishments include serving as the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the RAND Corporation. He was a lead author of the final report of the Independent Commission on the FBI's post-9/11 response to terrorism and radicalization. And between 2004 and 2006, he was a scholar in residence for counterterrorism at the Central Intelligence Agency. Professor Hoffman's books include Inside Terrorism and the award-winning Anonymous Soldiers, The Struggle for Israel, 1917 to 1947. So I am delighted to introduce Professor Bruce Hoffman.
Thank you, Stuart, for the very kind introduction and indeed for the invitation to address this conference. It's a great pleasure and honor, not least because I've had the opportunity to meet so many of the contributors to Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, who I've corresponded with over the years but never met in person, including Stuart Moore as well. Now, somewhat counterintuitively for a conference on cutting-edge technology and terrorism and counterterrorism, I'm going to resort to the old school method of reading a paper. Unfortunately, I'm too stuck in a mindset that when you're asked to give a keynote address at an august event like this, one, like you put on a jacket and tie, read a paper. So I hope that it's done with reasonable brio. And also because I was asked to talk about trends in terrorism affecting ISIS and al-Qaeda and to contextualize it with the role of social media. It seemed to cover so much ground that it made more sense in terms of my own cohesion, my own thinking to read it. So here goes. Light up the fire on the flowing crowd. Pour grenades on the crusader's head. Don't have mercy until he is broken. This was the encrypted message that a Moroccan-born ISIS operative in Italy received from his commanders in the Middle East via WhatsApp last year. Although the Italian authorities were able to thwart the series of attacks planned for that country, their French, Belgian, Turkish, German, and British counterparts have been tragically less successful in preventing the succession of bloody ISIS-inspired or directed incidents that have convulsed Europe since 2015. Indeed, according to one compilation, ISIS to date has carried out 150 attacks in over 24 countries that, excluding the ongoing carnage in Syria and Iraq, have claimed the lives of over 2,000 persons. There was a time not so long ago when the conventional wisdom was that ISIS's violence would somehow remain confined to the perennially volatile and sanguinary Levant and Iraq. That wishful thinking was swept aside on November 13, 2015, by the biggest attack on a Western city in over a decade. With no advance warning and in defiance of the prevailing analytical assumption that ISIS wasn't even interested in mounting external operations, and indeed lacked the capability to do so, 6 simultaneous attacks killed 130 persons and wounded nearly 400 others. Just 2 weeks earlier, the group was similarly able to perpetrate the single most significant attack against commercial aviation in over a decade. A bomb placed on a Russian charter flight exploded shortly after departing Sharm el-Sheikh, killing all 224 persons on board. The fact that ISIS has continued to pose a salient threat to Europe's security for a second summer in a row should make us very circumspect that we have any conception, should make us very circumspect about any conception we may have of fully understanding ISIS's capabilities and intentions, much less the threat that it will continue to pose after the fall of Mosul and then of Raqqa, and even beyond a post-caliphate world. Because ISIS's emergence and al-Qaeda's stubborn resilience, today we arguably face the most parlous security environment since the period immediately following the September 11th, 2001 attacks, with serious threats emanating from not one, but two terrorist movements, who have both cultivated a myriad of branches and affiliates, thus enhancing their capabilities and ensuring their longevity. Their respective harnessing and exploitation of social media has played a significant role in fostering this lamentable situation. ISIS, alas, is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. Some 2 years before the 2015 Paris attacks, ISIS had built an external operations network in Europe that mostly escaped notice. Known as the Aman al-Kharji, or simply as ENMI or Omni, the respective Turkish and Arabic rendering of the word Omniat, or security service, this unit appears to function independently of the group's waning military and territorial fortunes. For instance, US intelligence and defense officials, quoted by Rukmini Callimachi in her revealing August 2016 New York Times article, believe that ISIS has already sent hundreds of operatives into the European Union, with hundreds more having been dispatched to Turkey as well. If accurate, this investment of operational personnel ensures that ISIS will retain an effective international terrorist strike capability in Europe, irrespective of its battlefield reverses in Iraq and Syria. ISIS's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has already instructed potential foreign fighters who are unable to travel to the caliphate to instead emigrate to other vilayets where ISIS branches are located. This suggests that these other branches will likely develop their own external operations capabilities, independent of the parent organization, and themselves will present significant future threats, much as al-Qaeda's franchises have over the past decade done so in Yemen, North Africa, and South Asia, among other places. The alleged involvement of ISIS's Libyan branch in last month's horrific bombing of a Manchester concert venue points to the realization of al-Baghdadi's diktat. Moreover, in addition to the presumed sleeper cells that ISIS has seeded throughout Europe, there is the further problem of at least some of the estimated 7,000 European foreign fighters returning home. They are only a fraction of the nearly 40,000 persons from more than 100 countries throughout the world who have traveled to be trained in Syria and Iraq. What this means is that in little more than 4 years, ISIS's international cadre has surpassed even the most liberal estimates of the number of foreign fighters that the US intelligence community believes journeyed to Afghanistan during the 1980s and the 1990s in order to join al-Qaeda. In other words, far more foreign nationals have been trained by ISIS in Syria and Iraq during the past couple of years than more by al-Qaeda in the dozen or so years leading up to the September 11th, 2001 attacks. This creates the same constellation of organizational capabilities and trained operatives that made al-Qaeda so dangerous 16 years ago. And unlike the comparatively narrow geographical demographics of prior al-Qaeda recruits, ISIS's foreign fighters cadre includes hitherto unrepresented nationalities, such as hundreds of Latin Americans, along with citizens from Mali, Benin, Bangladesh, and the small Caribbean island state of Trinidad and Tobago, among other atypical jihadi recruiting grounds. Meanwhile, the danger from lone wolf attacks also remains. The late ISIS commander, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani's famous September 2014 summons to battle has hitherto proven far more compelling than al-Qaeda's long-standing efforts similarly to animate, motivate, and inspire individuals to engage in violence in support of its aims. Using a variety of freely available social networking platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and Flickr, among others, terrorists and insurgent groups today have introduced an even more direct and personally intimate form of messaging. ISIS has positioned itself at the forefront of this new revolution in terrorist communications. Indeed, since 2014, it has produced and disseminated a succession of increasingly more heinous and grisly propaganda videos of brutal executions and similar depredations that have captured the attention of a new generation of terrorist recruits. These videos and their unrestrained exaltation of violence have attracted many more viewers than Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri's comparatively priggish presentations recanting complex theological treatises or impacting didactic, philosophical, and historical lectures. Where al-Qaeda and its affiliates saw the internet as a place to disseminate material anonymously or meet in dark spaces, Robert Hannigan, the director of GCHQ, has noted, ISIS has embraced the web as a noisy channel in which to promote itself, intimidate people, and radicalize new recruits. ISIS has thus been remarkably effective in its use of these social media to speak to a global audience, thereby completely bypassing and thwarting the traditional media from misinterpreting or otherwise distorting ISIS's core message. A common ISIS propaganda refrain, accordingly, is "Don't hear about us, hear from us." These social media platforms facilitate both ubiquitous and real-time communication between like-minded radicals with would-be recruits and potential benefactors, the phenomenon known as narrowcasting. Also called niche marketing or target marketing, Gabi Weiman, the renowned Israeli terrorist communications expert, explains, narrowcasting aims media messages at specific segments of the public, defined by characteristics such as values, preferences, demographic attributes, or location. Ease, interactivity, networking, reach, frequency, usability, stability, immediacy, publicity, and permanence are among the benefits to terrorist groups like ISIS, who have nimbly adapted these technologies for their nefarious purposes. I don't think it's far-fetched to say that the internet is a major reason why ISIS is so successful and so worrying. An unnamed American intelligence officer commented in a May 2, 2016 article detailing ISIS's mastery of digital media and technology. ISIS foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq have accordingly in the past individually amassed thousands of followers on platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. They communicated with their audiences, often on a daily basis, and sometimes multiple times each day, providing firsthand, immediate accounts of historic battles and more mundane daily activities. In other words, making jihad accessible and comprehensible on a uniquely intimate and personal basis. These fighters invited, motivated, animated, and summoned their digital media followers and friends and other online contacts to come to Syria and Iraq and partake of the holy war against the apostate regimes of Bashar al-Assad and Haider al-Abadi. Blatant sectarian messages, coupled with divinely ordained clarion calls to resist Persian domination and decisively affect the outcome of the eternal struggle between Sunni and Shia, the latter the Alawite satraps, provide additionally compelling incentives. Indeed, a 2014 ISIS recruitment video circulated via social media featured heavily armed militants with distinctive British and Australian accents, trumpeting the virtues of jihad and the ineluctable religious imperative of joining the caravan of martyrs. Through these voices, the group was able to tailor its messages to specific target audiences back in these fighters' own neighborhoods, schools, clubs, community centers, and mosques. Whereas the older versions of terrorist websites effectively were waiting for visitors to arrive, Weiman argues, a social networking approach allows terrorists to reach their target audiences and virtually knock on their doors. ISIS's unbridled visual depictions of particularly gruesome executions and other wanton acts of violence galvanized the attention of this select audience and beseeched them to join ISIS's struggle. A new generation of celebrity fighters, accordingly, has been created to facilitate this process. Ultraviolence, as Jessica Stern and J.M. Berger termed this phenomenon, sold well with the target demographic for foreign fighters, angry, maladjusted young men whose blood stirred at images of grisly beheadings and the crucifixion of so-called apostates. Other types of appeals, using more traditional messages intended for more mainline religious audiences, have also been used by ISIS to target an entirely different demographic. Familiar historical and theological references are evoked for this particular audience's consideration, and specific solicitations are directed to the descendants of pious families of ancient, respected lineage and stature. ISIS propagandists also portray the organization as messengers and executors of apocalyptic prophecies, promising the imminence of an inevitable clash between the forces of good and evil in an epic, decisive battle as part of a compelling narrative with which to target potential recruits. These themes both resonate with and have a very powerful effect on their intended audience. According to Will McCants, ISIS's eschatological arguments have infused the group with newfound momentum, producing an onrush of foreign fighters to Syria, many of them seeking a role in the end-time drama. For terrorists today, the advantages of these new social media are thus as profound as they are manifold. It is therefore also not surprising to find that all of al-Qaeda's most important affiliates, al-Shabaab, Ansar al-Sharia, the Abdullah Azzam brigades, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Jabhat al-Nusra, and the Afghan Taliban all have Twitter accounts on which they regularly tweet. In fact, during its lethal assault on Nairobi, Kenya's Westgate Shopping Center in September 2013, al-Qaeda's Somali branch, al-Shabaab, provided live, ongoing commentary of the operation over Twitter. In this respect, it should be noted that while ISIS has dominated the headlines and preoccupied our attention the past 3 years, al-Qaeda has meanwhile been quietly rebuilding and marshaling its resources for the continuation of its 20-year-long struggle. Indeed, its presence in Syria should be regarded as just as dangerous and even more pernicious than that of ISIS. The priority that al-Qaeda attaches to Syria may be seen in the special messages conveyed in February and June 2012, respectively, by al-Zawahiri and the late Abu Yahya al-Libi in support of the uprising against the Assad regime, calling upon Muslims in Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon to do everything within their power to assist in the overthrow of the apostate Alawites. The fact that Jabhat al-Nusra, or Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, regardless of what it calls itself today, is even more capable than ISIS and a more dangerous long-term threat seems completely immaterial to those across the region who not only actively support and assist it, but actively seek to partner with Jabhat Fatah al-Sham with what they perversely regard as a more moderate and reasonable rival to ISIS. These deliberate obfuscations, both to eschew the al-Qaeda name and portray its most important franchise in a more benign light than ISIS, is a reflection of a calculated strategic choice taken by al-Zawahiri at a pivotal moment in al-Qaeda's history. In 2013, he instructed the movement's fighters to avoid mass casualty operations in order not to cause the death of Muslim civilians and innocent women and children. The legacy of this edict is evident in a tweet by a Dutch fighter belonging to Jabhat al-Nusra, who eagerly reminded his followers that, unlike ISIS, quote unquote, al-Qaeda focuses mostly on political and military targets instead of civilians. This development may be seen as fitting neatly into al-Zawahiri's broader strategy of letting ISIS take all the heat and absorb all the blows from the coalition arrayed against it, while al-Qaeda quietly rebuilds its military strength and basks in its paradoxical cachet as moderate extremists, in contrast to the unconstrained ISIS. Anyone inclined to be taken in by this ruse would do well to heed the admonition of Theopadnos, nee Peter Theo Curtis, the American journalist who spent 2 years in Syria as a captive of Jabhat al-Nusra. Padnos relates how the Nusra Front higher-ups were inviting Westerners to the jihad in Syria, not so much because they needed more foot soldiers. They didn't. But because they want to teach the Westerners to take the struggle into every neighborhood and subway back home. Finally, the importance of Syria to al-Qaeda's plans may be seen in the members of the group's senior commanders who have operated there. Muhsin al-Fadli, a bin Laden intimate who until his death from a U.S. airstrike in 2014 commanded the Khorasan group, al-Qaeda's elite forward-based operational arm in Syria. Haydar Kirkan, a Turkish national and long-standing senior al-Qaeda commander, had been sent back to his homeland, presumably by bin Laden himself in 2010. Kirkan's orders were to build an infrastructure in the region to facilitate the movement of key personnel hiding in Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas in order to escape the escalation of drone strikes ordered by President Obama. Kirkan was killed last fall as a result of a U.S. bombing raid in Idlib, Syria. And in late 2015, al-Zawahiri dispatched Saif al-Adil, al-Qaeda's most experienced and battle-hardened senior commander, to Syria in order to oversee the group's interests there. With this senior command structure in place, al-Qaeda is thus well-positioned to exploit ISIS's weakening military position and territorial losses, and once again regain its preeminent position at the vanguard of the Salafi jihadi movement. ISIS, in any event, can no longer compete with al-Qaeda in terms of influence, reach, manpower, and cohesion. In one domain only is ISIS currently stronger than its rival: the ability to mount spectacular terrorist strikes in Europe. And this is only because al-Qaeda has apparently decided for the time being to abjure from this type of operation. Looking to the immediate future, ISIS's continuing setbacks and serial weakening arguably create the conditions where some reconciliation with al-Qaeda might yet be effected. Efforts to reunite have been continuous from both sides, virtually from the time of ISIS's expulsion from the al-Qaeda fold. Regardless of how it might occur, any kind of reconciliation between ISIS and al-Qaeda, or reamalgamation or cooperation, would profoundly change the current conflict and result in a significantly escalated threat of foreign fighter terrorist operations in the West. Regardless of ISIS's future prospects, it has incontestably shaped the nature of both terrorist communications and operations these past 3 years. This suggests that its impact will be felt and its influence will continue far into the future. Terrorism from this particular enemy in the past came in either one of two forms. The first entailed the long-established, directly controlled and tightly orchestrated operation involving trained terrorists with an identifiable command, control, and communication chain of command, while the second embodied the more recent phenomena of lone wolf terrorism. Individuals without any prior formal connection with the terrorist entity who via social media and other communications are radicalized and encouraged to commit acts of violence independently of, but nonetheless on behalf of or in service of the aims of a terrorist organization. ISIS, however, has now perfected a third hybrid option of the so-called enabled attacker. Although this person conforms to the lone wolf model, the terrorist command structure in this instance directly furnishes this independent operative with very specific targeting instructions and accompanying detailed intelligence, both to promote an attack against this particular target set and thereby enhance its likelihood of success. Thus, what the FBI calls the flash to bang, the time that it takes a person from radicalization to becoming operational, the process of political awareness to violent extremists, from talking and listening to actually picking up a gun or placing a bomb, has now been tremendously reduced, making it far more difficult for both intelligence and law enforcement authorities to identify, interdict, and thwart an attack. In the final analysis, a movement's longevity ultimately depends upon its ability to recruit new members as well as to appeal to an expanding pool of both active supporters and passive sympathizers. The role of effective communication in this process is pivotal, ensuring the continued flow of fighters into the movement, binding supporters more closely to it, and drawing sympathizers more deeply into its orbit. Without communication, Alex Schmid and Yanni de Graaf presciently argued more than 30 years ago, there can be no terrorism. The revolution in terrorist communications, utilizing social media, has facilitated this process in hitherto unimaginable ways. That it has unfolded so rapidly and become so ubiquitous ensures that terrorists' reliance on and exploitation of digital technology is certain to continue. Its immensely appealing capabilities and technologically dynamic products will likely become increasingly more sophisticated in quality, content, rapidity, intimacy, and transmission capacity, and more numerous and pervasive than ever. The implications of this phenomena are perhaps only now beginning to be understood, as are the means necessary to effectively counter it, which is why this conference is both immensely timely and vitally important. Indeed, what is clear is that as terrorist communications continue to change and evolve, so will the nature of terrorism itself. While one cannot predict what new forms and dimensions terrorism will assume during the rest of the 21st century, this evolutionary process will not only continue, but will be abetted and accelerated by new communications technologies, much as terrorism has been sustained in the past. Thank you very much.